Hey, YouTube, it's Dwayne here. So today I have special guests, plural. That's right. I got two special guests with me on the show today. We are welcoming on Peter GURRY and Elijah Hixson. And you probably have heard the names if you were doing some stuff in the textual critical community. Peter and Elijah, could you go ahead and say hello to the audience?
Hey, everybody.
Hey,
All right. So we're just going to get straight into it. Elijah, I'll direct this at you. What got you into the field of textual criticism?
kind of a web of stuff that all came together. I'm from the South. I grew up in a church. We used the King James till I was 12, then shifted to the New King James. It wasn't a King James only church. My youth pastor was, and I have a ton of respect for him to this day because he actually taught us the Bible. It wasn't just pizza parties and games. I keep telling people I have, despite our disagreements, I have just all the respect in the world for this guy. But a lot of the churches in my area were either King James only or liberal, or even sort of like default King James, or there wasn't much thought put into it, but it was just, that's just what you do, including several members of my family. At one point I knew if I broke from that, I need to really understand the issues and know what I'm doing. And so that's one angle. The other angle is in college, I majored in chemistry. I really like things that I can measure and see. And when you deal with a manuscript, it's oftentimes not as speculative as, just in theology, I would joke, it's just sort of, well, I think this means this. Whereas if you're dealing with a manuscript, it's a question of, was this an alpha or is it a lambda? Well, why is it a lambda and not an alpha? It's something you can see and measure. And so that really appealed to me on that level. So all those things coming together kind of got me into textual criticism.
Right. And what would you say is like your most the biggest thing that you're most proud, or the work in what you do that you're most proud of? What's your biggest achievement by your standards?
By my standards, I don't know. It's not a question that I've really thought of. I kind of hope that by the end of my life, I can look back and say, well, I've been a faithful Christian.
Right.
Getting to know GURRY is probably my biggest achievement. Right.
Nice. So we have a little bit in common because when I started my walk, and I say a little bit, but when I started my walk as a Christian, I found myself in a King James Version only church, and it was extreme King James. We're talking like Ruckmanite. King James Version onlyism. Thing that I learned at that place was just a love of God's word. Like there's no church that I've been to that had a love for God's word as much as this King James only church had. So I'm actually quite thankful for them instilling that sort of love in me. So let's move on to Peter. First things first, you got to tell me about your hatred for Comic Sans and papyrus.
Brother, we don't have time for that. That is a long discussion. Just stop it. Just stop using it, people. Okay. There are other fonts out there that look like they're handwritten and are not as terrible. Right?
So
even the guy that invented Comic Sans regrets doing it. You can look this up. It's
that's
on the
funny.
If I ever get to a point where I'm supervising students, I'm going to have them write their whole dissertation in Comic Sans and ask you to be the outside reader.
So I'm doing all the post processing, so I can Comic Sans and papyrus all over the place here. Anyway,
I'm ready for it.
So Peter, can you tell us a little bit about how you got involved in textual criticism?
When I went to high school, I was homeschooled up until high school, and when I got to high school, the enrollment counselor my freshman year gave me an option. He said you can either take Spanish or Greek as your foreign language. And I was the youngest of 5 kids in my family, and I always hated doing what everybody else did. So everybody else in my family and pretty much everybody else at the school took Spanish. And so I just said, well, I'll take Greek because I didn't want to do what everybody else did. Through 4 years of high school Greek, I realized I really liked languages and I really liked the Greek New Testament. And I still remember the day we got our first Greek New Testament in that class. And it really fascinated me how we had this printed Greek New Testament, and that was what was behind my English Bible that I had grown up with. So that started my interest in the question of how we got the Bible. And then when I went to Bible college after high school, I realized there was a step even behind my printed Greek New Testament, right? That there were all these hand-copied manuscripts. And so it's kind of like going one step further back in the process. And so that kind of got me hooked on it.
Well, that's cool. It's kind of like computer programming. You see all these computer programming languages, and underneath that language, there's a deeper one until you get essentially to bare metal. There's a commonality there. I came from a programming background, so I can see there's some definite things going on there. So why I wanted to bring you on to the show today was a couple of reasons. So I'm not an expert by any means, and when I'm not an expert about something, I want to talk about it, I like to bring on experts. You guys are definitely, I would say, experts in your field in textual criticism. So we're going to cover a couple things. The first one was I've had an opportunity to talk to a couple people about confessional bibliology, and confessional bibliology is, I'll call it TR advocacy, because I guess there's some loaded things with TR only or King James Version only. So to be charitable to this group of believers, I'm just going to call it TR advocacy. I think that's the safest way to go about it. In your mind, and I'll let you two kind of talk this out, what's the problem with TR advocacy? What do you think is the main issue with that?
Are you talking about where it goes wrong, or what is the problem with it? Because I would see those weaknesses and problems. I would take as two different things. So what I mean by that is, when I see somebody saying, oh, if you have an ESV, you don't even have a Bible, to me, that's a big problem. That's, ironically, that's the same lie that Satan told in the garden, yea, hath God said. That, and I even had a lady at my church recently said, I read the NIV, is that okay? Because I know there's some people that really don't think that's okay. And I had to talk her through that. So to me, the problem of it is seeing all other Bibles as corruptions and as not real Bibles. I would say, if I were stranded on a desert island and I had just a Textus Receptus, I would be really happy that I have God's word.
Right.
And I've also heard at least one Byzantine prioritist say, if he were stranded on an island and only had Westcott and Hort, he would be happy to have a copy of God's word. I don't see anybody sharing that type of respect, I guess, for other editions, because there's no way to deny that God has used the Byzantine text throughout the Greek church,
Right.
the Textus Receptus in early Protestantism, stuff like the NIV and the ESV now throughout Christianity. But that's not a weakness of the position. I think that's just what I would see as a problem with it.
Yeah, and that's kind of something that I've been thinking about and sort of saying. I haven't come across it, like I haven't said this in any of my videos or anything like that. But I think part of the reality is that if you pull the Westcott and Hort text and then put the Textus Receptus beside it, I think we would be hard pressed to say that they were different books. I think we would all agree with that. Now, there's obviously variance and stuff between the two editions, and some of the major and most of the minor, but I don't think anybody in their right mind would conclude that they're totally different books. To kind of go with what you were saying, Elijah, is, God has worked through multiple translations, multiple texts. Like my wife, for example, grew up using the NIV, and I would say that she's a solid Christian, loves the Lord, loves his word. Some people I know in my church who use the NLT, they love the Lord, they love his word. So it becomes difficult to say, well, you don't have the word of God. I can totally relate to that. On the other hand, we talk about like the autograph or the originals. I know things have changed in the text critical community as far as the autograph, and some stuff that kind of comes out, especially from TR advocates, is that we're no longer searching for the autographs. Is that true?
Who's the we is the main thing to ask about that question, right? So, somebody like Jeff Riddle, I've gone back and forth with him on this, because are there people in the academy who do not think the original text is a viable goal or even a good goal to aim for? Absolutely. Do they represent the entire academic guild of text criticism? No, they don't. Some of them are prominent, some of them are very good scholars and very important, like David Parker for sure. Mm-hmm. But with due respect to David Parker, he doesn't represent the entire field. So to the degree that there are a whole bunch of us still in the field working on text criticism who still think the original text is a viable goal, the answer is no. So it's yes and no, depends who you.
Right.
For the past 3 years, I've worked full-time for 2 and then part-time in the past year. I've worked with Dirk Jonkind on a forthcoming textual commentary for the Tyndale House Greek New Testament. And early on, we had this discussion of like, how are we phrasing it? I have a terrible memory for stuff like this, but I think it was Dirk who said, let's just use the phrase original text because that's what we mean.
Right.
And so throughout the textual commentary, that's the language that we've used, at least in all of the drafts that we've done for the past 3 years. We're identifying the original text, and that's really the purpose of it.
So would you guys go on record and say that you are concerned with finding the original text?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Awesome.
If we want to nitpick at the words, I think identify the original text might be, because if you find something that's lost, right, you identify something that's there. And I think that it gives a slightly more accurate nuance to what we do.
So let's kind of turn gears here. Let's flip over to the CBGM. So I like it because when I say coherence-based genealogical method, makes me sound a lot smarter than I actually am. So I'm going to ask the question. I know it's a complicated question, but can we distill what CBGM is?
No. Next question.
It's a computer that solves all of our problems, right?
Yes, it's an android. It's like, have you seen Terminator? It's like the Terminator.
It's like the Terminator.
So yes, here's my best attempts at a one sentence definition. It is a system of computer tools for evaluating and studying a new type of evidence to help us relate the text of manuscripts to each other. That's the best I can do in one sentence. In simpler terms, it uses computers to help us relate the text of manuscripts to each other, to help us better resolve the differences between them.
So I mentioned before that I have like a little bit of a software background,
Yeah.
and we often talk about black boxing. So that's when we take some really, really complicated code, we cover it up so no one can see it, and we expose the inputs, so what goes in, and then we expose the outputs, what comes out.
Yeah.
So if we black box CGBM, what do we put into CBGM, and what do we get out of it?
Well, I really don't like the term black box for it because
Sure.
you know, you can read about it and study about it and you can understand everything inside the box if you have enough time. But in terms of what you put into it,
understand it all.
well, that's fair enough. Okay? I've done my best.
I hear Elijah Hixson loves CBGM and wants to marry it.
He does. That's true, actually. Yes. So what do you put into it? Well, you put in the text of manuscripts to it. And one of the things that's unique to it is, whereas in the past we've tend to work from selective data, the CBGM takes account of a lot more data than we have in the past. So it still doesn't take in everything. We're still not accounting for all the spelling differences that we could include, because that would just become a mess. But it takes kind of a lot more data because you're putting in complete transcriptions of manuscripts into the computer.
Okay.
Then what you're doing is the computer is telling you at each point where these manuscripts differ from each other. At each point where they do, the computer asks you as the human being to say, how do you think the differences relate? How do the variants develop? And you say, well, I think this manuscript, or I think this reading was the first one, so that's A. I think this reading was the second one, so that's B. And I think this one was third, so that's C. Okay. The computer asks you to do this in as many places as you can. And there's thousands of them, say in a book. In something like the Book of Acts. And you make as many of these judgments as you can as a human being, okay, making your human judgment. And then the computer starts to collect your own information that you've told it, right? It takes all those little tiny relationships that you've accumulated now over thousands of places, and it starts to feed that back to you by aggregating the data and saying, well, look, when it comes to these witnesses, these manuscripts and their texts, you thought that this one had an earlier reading 9 times out of 10, whereas you thought this one had it 8 times out of 10. It obviously gets more complicated from there, but that's the gist of it. You start to use that data to then start to relate the witnesses to each other, and you start to use those relationships to help you resolve the more difficult decisions, because you may have made 1,000 decisions, but you left 200 of them open because you said, man, I could go either way, and I need more data to help resolve the difference. And sure enough, the data from those first 1,000 decisions is exactly the kind of data that may help you with those next 200.
Right. So CBGM is essentially aggregating the results of your previous decisions and basically bundling them up to help you make further decisions.
Yes. Now, the one thing I left out that is pretty important there is, along with aggregating your own decisions, it's putting that together with the more objective data of how each pair of witnesses relates to each other. So I told you put all the data into the computer, right, from the manuscripts. It can immediately tell you at that point, without you making any judgments at all, it can say to you, hey, these 2 manuscripts agree 95% of the time where we can compare them. They disagree at 5%. These 2 other manuscripts agree at only 80% of the time, and they disagree at 20% of the time. Well, that immediately starts to tell you something about their relationship.
Right.
So even on the front end where you're making your own decisions as a human being, the computer is already giving you some data that you didn't have before. Namely, it's giving you that information about how closely individual witnesses relate to each other, and that can be quite useful to you as well.
Right. So Elijah, you had mentioned I think before in a conversation we had that you were a little bit skeptical of CBGM. So what is it about CBGM that makes you go,
This is not my area. I like individual manuscripts and looking at them as artifacts, and I think that's why GURRY and I do well with each other, is because we both kind of start at opposite ends and then work towards the middle. And so I'm really not qualified to evaluate it in that sense, but I do like some of the basic assumptions that it operates on, which I've got in the Mink article. A scribe wants to copy the forlaga with fidelity. That's the first basic assumption. I don't know that is an assumption all the time that holds true, because we see corrections and we got to ask, what is the purpose of the correction? If the purpose of the correction is just to correct miscopyings from that manuscript, then that's one thing. But a lot of times corrections are comparing this text to something else. And so that's sort of intentionally not copying from the first source and copying from a different one. Also, if a scribe introduces diverging variants, they come from another source, i.e. they are not invented. Well, that may be true at some point, but where did any of them come from if they weren't invented at some point first?
Right.
That makes me wonder as well. And you can have an instance where there's a miscopy, like a genuine mistake that results in a sensible new reading, like a word order difference or something like that.
Right.
That is something that is a real reading, but doesn't come from another source. But it also isn't sort of the product of a crafty scribe changing the text. It's an accident. Some of those questions I just wonder about. I'll put it that way.
Fair enough. So another question then for Peter, when it comes to the CBGM and the current, the Westcott and Hort style methods of evaluating manuscripts, do they work together, or does CBGM completely replace that altogether?
That's a good question. No, they very much work together. So if we're thinking, when you say Westcott and Hort, if we're thinking in terms of their classic distinction between, say, internal and external evidence.
Sure. Yeah.
And internal evidence, we're thinking, we're thinking through things like, well, what are the typical kinds of mistakes that scribes make? And what should we expect this particular author that we're working with to have said, given what he says elsewhere? Those things are all absolutely still in play. So when I describe the human being making judgments, that's exactly what the human being is doing, right? And they're using all the tools available to them to make those judgments.
Gotcha. So CBGM is more a supplement to current methodologies than it is a replacement. So it's like,
and I would say not even just a supplement, although I think that's fair. It's also a check. That is, it's a way to help us stay more consistent with our own decisions. Because the reality is, I'm going to pick on Hixson a little bit, but
sure.
By the time Hixson gets to the end of Matthew, working on the Tyndale edition, there are certain decisions that he's made that stick out heavily in his mind because they were hard ones, or because they were interesting, or because of the manuscripts involved, or because of how long it took him to make them. And those decisions naturally weigh more heavily in his mind than the 100 other decisions that did not fit one of those categories. And so the temptation, I think, as a human being, and it's not always a bad temptation, it can be good, but the temptation is to let individual decisions outweigh the totality of the decisions you make. And one of the benefits of using computers is the computers stay very neutral. The computer does not care if the decision took you an hour to make or 2 minutes, right?
Right.
It's still a decision. So it's very valuable for presenting us with statistics and information about our own judgment and their accumulation that we wouldn't have otherwise, or that we'd be tempted to ignore because of the way our minds grasp onto certain decisions we make and let other ones kind of fade into the background. Now, what we do with that data, of course, requires further human judgment, obviously.
Right.
But the point is, the computer can be very neutral in terms of it does not care. So one of the things I did in my dissertation on the CBGM was I said, what happens if we make the initial text in the CBGM, if we make it the Byzantine text? If at every point of difference between the Byzantine text and the Nestle Aland, I pick the Byzantine text as the earliest reading, and the computer does not care. It didn't start smoking when I did that. My computer didn't break and crash on me when I put the Byzantine text, and it went, no, you can't do that, right? Because we love Vaticanus too much. No, it's a computer, right? So the objectivity of the computer can be a real asset to us.
My response to that, though, is people aren't consistent. Like, scribes are persons, and a person will do weird, unpredictable things.
Right. The point isn't to make us say, like, well, because you picked this manuscript 9 times out of 10, you had better pick it the 10th. But the point is, you don't even remember what you did. And it seems pretty relevant for us as scholars to at least be confronted, and I think that's the right term to use, to be confronted with our own decisions
Right,
over time,
right.
right? Consistency can be overrated in the sense of like, what we're doing is not, this is not engineering, right?
Right,
Text criticism
right.
is not like,
No.
pouring concrete or something like that, where we got to be absolutely precise and whatever. Like, it requires a skill, and we are doing with human scribes, and sometimes the human being needs to say, I know what the computer is showing me, but I don't care.
Right,
Because
right.
I spent a lot of time with manuscripts, and I know scribes make this type of mistake, and this
Mhm.
sure looks like that kind of.
I wish I had written it down, but I was reading the textual commentary in Acts in the ECM, and
Yeah.
there was one place where the textual commentary said almost that. It was
Yeah.
something to the effect of, the CBGM tells us that this is clearly the case, but obviously that can't
But
be
it's
it.
obviously not. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So CBGM isn't perfect, I guess is what you're saying. But it sounds like a helpful tool when it comes to tracking down the original text. When it comes to manuscripts, there's obviously marginal notes and stuff all over it. And I'm thinking of the one, I think it's Vaticanus, knave and fool. Why do you keep changing the readings? Does CBGM take into account some of the readings found in the margins or correctors or things like, how does that work?
Yes, that's a good question. Right now, no, I don't. Oh gosh, man, that's a good question. It's in my dissertation. I'm trying to remember now. I don't want to get this wrong. My memory is that no, the CBGM does not take corrections into account. In other words, it does not treat them as a separate witness.
Right.
It essentially only takes into account the firsthand, what we call the firsthand of a manuscript. And if I remember right, I think that's something I criticize it for.
Right.
But it does raise the issue of, there are really important questions we have to ask in the CBGM, because it's computerized, and again, the computer doesn't care, but we have to care. It raises really important questions about how we define text and what
Right.
counts and what doesn't.
Right.
So one example of this is in the CBGM. There are places where a scribe might be writing a word and he just flubs it. I write the word the, but I spell it TEH in an email, right? You know exactly what I meant to type. Okay?
Right.
But you're not thrown off by it at all. But TEH is not an English word. The CBGM is presented with a choice there. Is it going to count TEH as the text of that witness, or are we going to fix it and say, well, we know what he meant to say?
Right.
So we're actually going to count what he meant to say as the text, even though it's not actually on the page, right? Even though it's not in ink or on parchment.
Yeah.
We know that's what the scribe meant to write because we know Greek, he knew Greek, and this is not a Greek word, and it's obvious what Greek word he
Right.
meant.
So then what do you input in CBGM?
So then what do you put into CBGM? That question is not as daunting as you might think. It's not like that decision is going to throw
yeah
it one way
I
or
would
the
think
other,
like
but
it might not be
question.
it might not be like super crazy when it comes to determining what an actual reading is, but it might be really helpful when it comes to determining the quality of the work that the scribe has done, right? Because
Sure,
if you see a whole bunch of these, then you can determine, well, maybe this manuscript it's got some issues, we should give it a lower weighting.
Even that, I think, can be misleading, though. So in my dissertation, I worked with 3 manuscripts, and 2 of them, I think they were a master and an apprentice. And I made that case. If I could be wrong, but the apprentice was clearly not as well trained as the other one. The other one knew 2 different styles of handwriting that you see in the manuscript. That's an extra layer of training. The other one did not. What I found was that the other one, the one that I think was the apprentice, made a lot of dumb mistakes, like just sort of goofs, misspelled words and things. But apart from that, was a pretty careful copyist. So this scribe's goal was to actually get the text.
Right.
Whereas the other scribe, who was, I think, much better trained, took more liberties with what he was writing down. I don't think he reproduced the text as carefully. And it's not like, oh, let's change theology or whatever, but it was stuff like, I think he probably knew Mark's gospel really, really well.
Right.
And as he was copying Matthew, just bits of Mark slipped in, and he, in most cases, didn't bother correcting them, just left them there. Sometimes it's a good thing to have a scribe who didn't really know what he was doing that well, because that's someone who's not clever enough to mess with the text.